Ukraine moving, as we've been discussing at length in various programs, both here on this channel and on our main channel, the DURAN, and in Alex Christoforo's update, towards what looks like to be, if not exactly the military endgame, at least perhaps something that begins to approximate to it. Briefly, the Western media has suddenly woken up to the fact that the key town of Mariupol on the Sea of Azov is about to fall to the Russians, or I should say perhaps to a combination of three forces, all of which are active in Mariupol, fighting the Ukrainian military there, which is to say the Russian army, the militia of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and the irregular forces of the Chechen Republic, which is, of course, a constituent republic of the Russian Federation. There's suddenly been a flurry of news reports originating from Ukraine, which confirm that the fighting in Mariupol has now reached the city centre. And I've also received some reports, which are, I should stress, from Russian sources, and which I cannot corroborate, that the resistance now is largely, the Ukrainian resistance now, is now largely confined to the Azov-style steelworks, a gigantic factory, presumably on the outskirts of Mariupol, which is now, it seems, become the main focus of Ukrainian resistance, and where many of the soldiers of the hardline radical battalions, I have to use careful language here, but many identify the members of this battalion with the political movement that was so influential in Germany and Central Europe in the middle of the 20th century. Anyway, that the soldiers of this battalion, or of these forces, have now apparently withdrawn, or largely withdrawn, to the Azov-style factory for their last stand. Now, I want to make it again very clear that that last piece of information comes from Russian sources, which I cannot corroborate. I obviously don't have information, direct information on the ground. Other reports suggest that there are still Ukrainian forces resisting elsewhere in central Mariupol, though it seems that their chances of withstanding the advances of the Russians and of their militia and Chechen allies are now becoming increasingly slim. It's also apparently the case that Mariupol airport has now been captured by the Russians, and it seems that there are increasingly urgent requests from the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol, sent, interestingly enough, through phones and video appeals to the Ukrainian command in Kiev to send a force to relieve them, something which it's become absolutely obvious to me, and for some time, that the Ukrainian military is in no position to do. Now, I have to say that the latter is, to my mind, a completely predictable result of what one might call the propaganda of success that we have been hearing coming out of Kiev and much of the Western media for the last 2 weeks or so. If you are constantly claiming that you are winning the war when you're actually losing, then of course the risk you run is that people who are fighting will start to believe you and will start to make demands that you do things which you're not actually able to do. So it seems to me that the Ukrainian forces trapped in Mariupol, who presumably take their news from the Western media and from what Kiev has been saying, perhaps unsurprisingly, have acquired a false understanding of the war, and therefore have been demanding that action be taken to relieve them, to that a Ukrainian force be sent to break the siege of Mariupol, and perhaps predictably, and again, I have to say this, I can't corroborate this. I've seen some of the videos, but as I don't speak Ukrainian, I can't verify always what they say. But I get the sense that some of the people in Mariupol who are trapped there are starting to be a sort of narrative of betrayal is beginning to circulate amongst them. And perhaps not entirely without cause, because the Russian military have said that they actually made a proposal to the authorities in Kiev that these troops actually withdraw from Mariupol. The suggestion was that if they lay down their arms and agree to withdraw from Mariupol, and if Kiev agrees to have them withdraw from Mariupol, then the Russians would not stand in the way of that withdrawal. And very strangely, the Ukrainians rejected that proposal. And I find that difficult to understand, by the way, but there are possible explanations to it. One explanation is that people in Kiev have become either trapped within their own narrative of success, and they would find it difficult to admit that Mariupol was being abandoned in light of their various claims of success and victory, so that they found it very difficult to agree to this withdrawal in a way that would be consistent with their own narrative, and therefore they've been forced to reject it. Or alternatively, it could be that there is actually some kind of cognitive dissonance within Kiev itself, that perhaps some of the leaders there, some of the political leaders, have themselves believed this narrative and therefore are unable to bring themselves to accept that their position in eastern Ukraine, far from being successful, is actually disastrously critical. And that was another reason why they decided to reject this proposal. There is a third possibility, and I have to say it's the one that the Russians themselves are running with. I want to stress again, this is a Russian suggestion, which again, obviously, I cannot verify. But the Russians are saying that the reason that the authorities in Kiev apparently rejected the evacuation plan from Mariupol is because they're afraid that if some of these hardline radical forces are redeployed to Kiev, they could pose a potential threat to the government there. Obviously, as I said, that is a Russian construction of the reasons. I'm not able to verify or confirm it one way or the other. There is perhaps one final possibility, which is, of course, that Mariupol is an important city for Ukraine's economy. It's a major steel producer. And steel has been one of Ukraine's major exports. And, of course, it's also the last holdout that Ukraine has on the Sea of Azov. Its fall would be a recognition that the entire Sea of Azov is now under Russian control, and that the Russians now have a secure land bridge to Crimea. So perhaps there is a psychological inability to accept the retreat from Mariupol, because doing so would mean another admission that Ukraine is losing control of the Donbass and is losing control of the Sea of Azov, and that a Russian land bridge to Crimea is being created. I have to say that if the last is the reason, then I think it is a bad reason. I think that a military leadership should always take steps to protect the lives of its soldiers, difficult opinions as many of those soldiers appear to have. And I think that abandoning troops to their fate, encouraging them to engage in a hopeless last stand, is, to my mind, no kind of military strategy at all, when it can serve no useful strategic purpose. It's all very well to expect soldiers to lay down their lives to fight bitterly to the end. If we're talking about a battle like, say, the one in Stalingrad, when keeping the soldiers going, the Soviet soldiers, the Red Army soldiers in that case, fighting was essential in order to achieve that larger objective of a strategic envelopment that the Red Army carried out over the course of the Battle of Stalingrad. But if the reality instead is that people's lives are being thrown away to no useful purpose, then that serves no conceivable military logic that I can see. And if the opportunity to withdraw these forces from Mariupol was indeed there, then I have to say it seems to me that this is not just a mistake, but even in military terms, a crime. Anyway, that is my own view. I'm obviously not someone, as most of you realise, who believes in heroic last stands. I don't really see the logic of them, and if they result in people losing their lives, I find that deeply objectionable. Anyway, elsewhere in Donbass, it seems things are also going increasingly badly for the Ukrainians. It seems that they are now being pushed back from the areas in the outskirts of Donetsk. This was apparently the strongest line that the Ukrainians had, and even that apparently is crumbling. And it seems that the situation in and around the town of Severodonetsk in the north is now becoming critical, and the prospect of a greater strategic envelopment of the Ukrainian forces, the entire Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, now looks increasingly as if it's almost a done thing. We see, as I said, smaller encirclements around Mariupol, which is apparently now very close to arriving at its final point of collapse, and another encirclement around the town of Severodonetsk, which is also approaching the point of collapse. But it seems that the greater Ukrainian army in Donbass is now also in a position where its viability as a fighting force is becoming increasingly open to question. Meanwhile, the Russians have also been reporting that they have almost completed the blockade of the important southern city of Nikolaev. This is, I call it Nikolaev, the Ukrainians refer to it as Mykolaiv, but I've always known it throughout my life as Nikolaev, and I'm going to stick to that name, which I understand, by the way, is the one that most of the inhabitants of the city actually use. This is an important city, apparently a very beautiful city. It's referred to in some places as a garden city, inaugurated by Catherine the Great, with a great naval arsenal and shipyard, apparently in severe disuse, which for many years was one of the major shipyards of the Russian and then the Soviet fleet. Well, it's been apparently now almost entirely encircled, and this has left the prospects of the Ukrainians holding on to the city, which, by the way, is west of Crimea, so it's far detached from the right fighting in the Donbass. It's left the prospects of the Ukrainian defenders in this city now is apparently becoming increasingly difficult. And by the way, there have been more reports of missile strikes specifically on Ukrainian facilities in and around the city of Nikolaev, with Ukrainian forces there apparently suffering from Russian missile attacks, which are becoming increasingly dangerous for them. And at this point, perhaps I should say that the Russians have now started increasingly, or at least they've first started using their more advanced supersonic and hypersonic cruise missiles. There's reports, at least the Russians have said, that they've used for the first time one of their hypersonic missiles, the Kinjal or Dagger system, and that they've also used the supersonic Bastion system to attack Ukrainian military facilities. There is no air defense that is capable of intercepting these missile systems, and I suspect that the Russians are testing them out, but it's conceivable that we could start seeing them being used more actively over the next few days. So things are, shall we say, looking difficult for the Ukrainians, and there's the first indications that this narrative of success that we've been hearing coming out of Kiev over the last couple of weeks is now starting to break down. And there are perhaps two political developments, I say political developments, we'll come to what they mean in a moment, which might point in that direction also. The first is that it's now confirmed that Viktor Medvedchuk, the Ukrainian opposition politician, somebody who has been an opponent, a consistent opponent of the pro-Maidan governments that gained power in Ukraine ever since the events of 2014, and somebody who has been arrested by the Ukrainians on treason charges, that he's managed to escape house arrest, and it seems that his whereabouts are unknown. I am going to make a guess or a speculation that the Russians may have sprung him. He's presumably been held in Kiev or in its environs. The Russians have surrounded most of Kiev, not all of it. Contrary to some reports that I read in the Western media, it seems that the Russians have deliberately left access points in Kiev open to the south of Kiev to allow people to leave. So Kiev is not completely surrounded and has never been completely surrounded at any point in the war. But whatever, the Russians are very close to Kiev. They're essentially surrounded it from the north and west, and to some extent the east. And I'm sure they have their own people in Kiev and have had it all the time. So I'm guessing, again, I don't know, that they are responsible for Viktor Medvedchuk's disappearance, that they presumably arranged for his escape, in which case he could be, at the moment, protected by the Russians somewhere. Perhaps he's even in Moscow. That's a guess. Possibly the Ukrainians will capture him, recapture him. Maybe he's hiding somewhere in Kiev at the moment. But, I think it is more likely than not that it is the Russians who have arranged this. But this is only a guess, again, on my part. Now, if Medvedchuk is indeed free, then it's possible that if things turn in a certain direction, and if Kiev eventually does fall to the Russians, well, he seems to me a much more plausible person to take over the government in Kiev for the Russians than any of the various other people, Yevgeny Muraviev and all the others that have been suggested by people in the West. So we'll see what that's all about, but it could be the first indications that the Russians are looking beyond the Zelensky administration and are thinking of setting up some kind of alternative political structure in Ukraine. Medvedchuk does lead what is the biggest opposition party in Ukraine. He has had real political support and traction in Ukraine, and above all, the Russians trust him. So that is one event. We don't have full clarity on it. Perhaps he escaped by himself. Perhaps the Ukrainian police will recapture him. But it's at least equally plausible that he is now with the Russians or in Russia, or so it seems to me. Anyway, we will no doubt find out in due course. The other event is that Zelensky has now urgently called for what he calls comprehensive talks with the Russians. Now, that's not quite clear what he means by that, because, of course, talks have been underway with the Russians for several weeks now, since, in fact, the Russian military operation in Ukraine got started. So it's not obvious to me what Zelensky means by comprehensive talks, as opposed to the talks which have already been underway. But it does look as if this reference to comprehensive talks may mean that he does in fact now seek some kind of diplomatic and political solution with the Russians that goes beyond the proposals that have been floated up to now. In other words, that he's prepared finally to make some of the substantive concessions that the Russians have been demanding ever since this conflict began back in February. So we'll see what that means. But again, the very fact that Zelensky is calling for comprehensive talks may be a sign that realities are starting to break through, and that people in Kiev, there's some reports, by the way, which of course I can't verify, that Zelensky isn't in Kiev at all, that he's in all sorts of places. I'm not going to speculate about that. I don't think anybody really knows. But anyway, that Zelensky, whom I'm going to assume is in Kiev, is starting to understand the gravity of the situation, and those around him are starting to understand it too. Anyway, I want to stress again, I don't want to imply from any of this that we are in any sort of end game yet, but perhaps we are starting to look at a situation where the end game begins to hover over the horizon. So we will see whether that's right, and we'll see how the situation on the ground develops over the next couple of days. Before finishing this video, want to return briefly to the Biden-Xi conversation which took place yesterday. The Chinese have now published a comprehensive readout of this discussion, in which it's clear, as I discussed yesterday, that Xi gave no ground on any substantive issue, and called again for the Western powers to negotiate directly with the Russians to try to address legitimate Russian security concerns, something of course which the Western powers have been deeply reluctant to do in any substantive way, any way that addresses the two key Russian points: that they want a commitment from the West that there will be no further eastward expansion of NATO, and that NATO military infrastructure created in Eastern Europe will be withdrawn back to the positions that existed before the NATO expansions that began in 1998. Now, I would say on the second point that far from NATO showing any willingness to withdraw its military infrastructure, at the moment all the indications are that instead it's seeking to reinforce it. But anyway, Xi did indeed call the US to start looking at discussing these problems with the Russians. And of course, he also severely criticized the US for its policy, its sanctions policy, which he called wrong and indiscriminate. But something else came through in the Chinese readout, which I found extremely striking. And that was that Xi apparently told Biden to his face that all kinds of commitments were made by Biden at their previous virtual summit meeting, specifically on Taiwan and on other issues, but that the United States has not acted on any of the assurances that the Americans gave. Well, I touched on that in my previous video. But what I didn't realize is that the Chinese readout says that on hearing Biden give the same reassurances all over again, Xi told Biden that he noted that and took it extremely seriously. But nonetheless, Xi remained concerned that the US was not acting in accordance with Biden's earlier promises. Now, that is as close as one can get in a diplomatic discussion to a statement to the other side that they're acting in bad faith. That is what Xi's comments to Biden amount to. That the Americans say one thing to the Chinese on issues like Taiwan and do the opposite. In fact, they are acting in a way that the Chinese see as ultimately hostile to themselves. And for that reason, I think the Chinese see